myself, but just as a FYI, your voice may appear on the recording for my students who couldn't be here. So yeah, my name is Michael Granado. Most of you probably don't know me. I'm a part-time instructor here, but Georgia Southern's my alma mater, where I graduated from with my philosophy degree. Took several classes with Dr. Eaton. It's what sparked all of this, why I'm here, I suppose. But yeah, I can't talk two things at once from the beginning. Here we go. So this is loosely based off of my thesis work. My thesis work is focused on a early 20th century French philosopher named Gaston Bachelard. And specifically what I focused on for my thesis is his philosophy of time. But I wanted to make this more broad to a wider audience. And so to do that, what I want to do is focus on a relatively forgotten debate, conversation, interaction. Wasn't really, I guess it wasn't a debate that happened between up until this point, kind of unknown French philosopher named Henry Bergson, and then a scientist who needs no introduction, Albert Einstein. The reason why I want to focus on this is for historically, I think it's incredibly important for a number of reasons, both in the history of philosophy and in history at large, which I'll kind of get into a little bit. We can just treat this as a regular classroom presentation. If you got questions, just interrupt. There is a lot of information I want to cover, but by all means, hit me. Yeah. Join us. It's all good. So yeah, if you got questions, ask away. Philosophy of time tends to be super obscure. There's a quote from the Buddha that I like, where he's talking about trying to achieve enlightenment, and he said it's like trying to tie the air into knots. I feel like that's what a lot of philosophy of time is. It's very obscure, and for the most part, I think it's kind of building castles in the sky. I tried to ground my philosophy of time more so in history. I'm taking a historical kind of perspective on this, if that helps where I'm coming from a little bit. But so yeah, what I've been doing, Henry Bergson, one of the most famous French philosophers at the beginning of the 20th century. Bergson's at the height of his popularity. We really don't have a close American equivalent to this. Bergson was so popular that lay people on the streets of France would try to, in Paris, crawl. They would literally crawl through the windows to try to hear him talk. That level of popularity, I don't have to tell you, philosophers aren't that. Name two famous philosophers, right? It's a different culture, different time, different place. But Bergson was extraordinarily popular, and at the beginning of the 20th century is kind of at the height of his popularity. Einstein's kind of the inverse of that. At the beginning of the 20th century, in 1905, Einstein has what's called his miracle year. He publishes 4 groundbreaking papers in physics that really puts him on the map, but he was working as a patent clerk prior to that. So they're at different ends of their career trajectories, so to speak. Bachelard's going to come in the generation following, although he's roughly the same age. He kind of gets a late start to his academic work, but comes in the generation following. So Einstein's writing in 1905. His popularizes relativity by 1916. The Einstein-Bergson debate, as we'll see, happens early 1922. Bachelard starts to write in the early 30s is when he writes his work on times. But what we're going to focus on is the interaction between Bergson and Einstein. So just to give you a little bit of a timeline here, like I said, Bergson is at the height of his popularity. That's because he publishes his major works prior to and at the beginning of the 20th century. His first major work, Time and Free Will, followed by Matter and Memory. Most of his work on time is coming from Time and Free Will, as the name suggests. Einstein, like I said, has his miracle year in 1905. He'll publish his paper on the electromagnetic effect, which is what eventually wins him the Nobel Prize in physics. And it's also in 1905 he publishes his paper on the electrodynamics of moving bodies, which is the beginning of his special theory of relativity. And that's where the stuff about time starts to come from, which is what I'm going to focus on. Bergson, Creative Evolution, probably his most popular work, comes in 1907. And then we have kind of a bummer, as an understatement, the First World War. First World War, it's hard. I don't really have time to really go into it, and I can't really emphasize how big of an impact the First World War had, not just on politics, obviously, not just on loss of life scale. Civilization almost came to an end. And that affected everything from philosophy to art to culture, like across the board. I bring that up. If you're interested, there's a really great history book called Einstein's War that talks about the political and social dimension of relativity, because Einstein had already developed both the special and general theory of relativity between 1905 and 1910. But it didn't really catch on until the 1920s. And the reason for that has everything to do with the First World War. And what I mean by the social political aspect in the philosophical aspect of the First World War, German scientific publications and German scientists were banned from British universities. You couldn't teach German science in English schools, and vice versa, right? So World War I kind of permeated everything, and then you have like weirdos like Wittgenstein that are like writing philosophy in the trenches and stuff like that. So political, philosophical influence. But after the First World War, as a way to mend and build philosophical bridges, scientific bridges, to get the communities talking to each other again, as a way to do that, there's a kind of an opening up, especially of academic institutions, and it's on this point that Einstein is invited to give kind of a European tour to promote his theory of relativity. And one of his first stops is going to be Paris, France, and he's invited there by the Society of French Philosophy to give a talk on relativity, and that's where he's going to meet Bergson. Shortly before that, a year before that, Einstein's awarded the Nobel Prize. Now, there's a common misconception in the history of science that Einstein got his Nobel Prize for his theory of relativity. He actually got it for the photoelectric effect, one of those previous papers that I mentioned. And it's his solution to, there's a big conversation, I'm going to touch on this a little bit, that's happening in the history of science, which is trying to explain what light is, which is kind of a strange thing to think about. This was a major scientific problem. There's two big theories. There's the particle theory of light, and then there's the wave theory of light. And Einstein was able to offer a solution that said, well, actually, it's both. And by solution, I mean a bunch of mathematical equations that I'm not really equipped to go into. But photons, that's where we get the idea of photons for. That's what he was awarded the Nobel Prize for. And one of the reasons why he wasn't awarded the prize for relativity actually goes back to Bergson. One of the chief objections that the Nobel Prize Committee listed for not considering relativity was that Bergson had raised had a lot of suspicions about relativity. And the suspicions that Bergson had to do with the fact that Bergson thought relativity was more philosophy than science. Bergson believed and argued that relativity was an epistemological position and not necessarily an empirical or scientific position. He didn't disagree with it, to be clear. He didn't disagree with it, but he just thought that it wasn't science. And Bergson's ideas carried so much weight, this was actually a reason why Einstein got the Nobel Prize for the photoelectric effect and not relativity, which is what led them to meet in Paris in 1922. But let's talk a little bit about their why they're disagreeing and why Bergson, what would lead Bergson to say such a thing. So Bergson writes a short article called An Introduction to Metaphysics. I think it's like 1903, 1904, something along those lines. And Bergson starts off this article by talking about two ways of knowing something, two ways of knowledge, how we can have knowledge of things. And he kind of makes this division between internal and external ways of knowing. You can consider any object, but if you consider an object like a dog, you can offer descriptions of a dog, linguistic descriptions. You can talk about the color of the dog's coat, the breed of the dog's personality, behaviors, whatever. Oh, did it cut off? Versus internal descriptions. Oh, scanning for a second. It'll boot back up.
We do have a good chalkboard.
Oh, yeah.
It never breaks.
Okay. Well, internal versus external, it's pretty straightforward. So external descriptions are mediated through things like language or through things, other symbolic representations like mathematics, right? You can describe the motion of the dog mathematically. Versus internal knowledge, and Bergson says this is the type of knowledge that permeates the object. It's knowledge from within. Is it not going to cut back on? Did the whole computer cut off?
Quite possibly.
Okay. I appreciate the help. So internal forms of knowledge would be subjective, qualitative experience of a thing. The chief examples that Bergson gives of internal forms of knowing, internal ways of knowing, would be like emotions, thoughts, and ideas that don't necessarily have a direct physical correlation to the outside world, but things that you are intimately familiar with. You've all felt happiness, I'm assuming, sadness, anger, frustration with technology, right? Yes?
Anecdotes are both, because are they both?
What's that?
Like anecdotes? I've never said it out loud, but ANECDOT.
Anecdote?
Anecdotes. Yeah, an anecdote. Yeah, it gets tricky with language. There's some things about language that may not necessarily, yeah, like gets to a classic like Wittgenstein problem with words like the or, expressions. I'm not sure what Bergson would say about anecdotes, but that's a good question.
Because it's something you're experiencing externally, you make a memory of it, like he has work on memory.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And then you attach
Right.
your feelings to it to
Yes.
create an idea.
Yes. So I guess that would be internal. So for Bergson, memory, even if it's memory of something external, even if I'm thinking about old memories of my family, that would still be an internal thing because it's happening solely within my mind. And for those of you that are interested in philosophy of mind, this has a very close relationship to modern problems like the hard problem of consciousness. I don't know if y'all have gotten into people like Chalmers and stuff like that, but there's a very close connection. Bergson's really kind of anticipating a lot of these questions and problems. Don't know what happened. I could bring it up on my personal laptop. That's all good. Well, we try. No, it's all good. Let's see. I'll just move this over here. Now, for Bergson, time is in a unique way. It falls into both categories. So we have both external descriptions of time, like clock time, right? The measurement of time, as well as mathematical descriptions of time. But we also have an internal experience of time. We have the internal experience of time passage. Yeah, sorry, all kinds of tech problems. Bergson says that's it. our internal experience of time he characterizes by the experience of duration, which he essentially means the passage of time, the flow and the movement of time. Did that start back up now? So we all have an internal experience of duration, and Bergson hinges a lot of this argument on a tradition that goes all the way back to Descartes, which is we know about duration through our sense of intuition. It's not necessarily something that has to be explained to us. I don't have to explain to you that you've grown older over the years and that you remember your past and you have a sense of who you were back then versus who you are now. It's just something that we intuitively know because we have intuitive access to it. Okay, I do need to figure out where I'm at on my presentation, but time for Bergson falls into both categories. To switch to Einstein for a moment. Oh, and there's an aspect of duration that is inherently qualitative and that just can't be expressed through quantification, can't be expressed through measurement, even with respect to time. So Bergson gives a lot of examples of this, like a shooting star. Motion for Bergson is something that illustrates duration, but my favorite example comes from Creative Evolution, where he talks about making his cup of coffee in the morning. I could sit there and measure how long it takes for me to make a cup of coffee, but the experience of making the cup of coffee can't necessarily be summed up just in the pure amount of time that it took to make the coffee. What cannot be captured by that, for example, is my anxiety over needing my caffeine fix, right? That's not captured in the measurement of time. So switching over to, so keep that in mind. Switching to Einstein for a moment. Don't have a whole lot of time to go into this, but when Einstein's writing in 1905, there's a couple of major ideas within physics that are changing. Oddly enough, the big thing that's going to lead Einstein to relativity is changing in the theories of light. And this goes all the way back to, well, I guess all the way back to the very beginning of philosophy. Lots of philosophers have written about light, and natural philosophers especially. But Newton, one of the things that stands out about Newton is he provided a very comprehensive physical theory of the universe. The Newtonian system of gravity, one of the unique things about it is that it was able to explain motion both on a terrestrial level here on Earth, but also at a celestial level. It explained the motion of the falling of an apple, for example, but it also explained the motion of the orbiting of the planets around the sun. That's why it was such a powerful theory and powerful explanation. But one of the big things that Newton was not able to explain was light. And the big reason why he had a hard time explaining light, Newton assumed that there was the assumption that light had to move through space in the same way that sound moves through air, that there needed to be some sort of medium to carry light for it to travel from point A to point B. And in outer space, that medium was assumed to be something that they called ether. If you've ever heard of this before, if you like the history of science. And Newton said that light consisted of tiny particles that move through the ether in the same way that sound waves move through the air. This was challenged in the 18th century. We moved from the particle theory of light to the wave theory of light, that light moves through waves, kind of like ripples on the face of water, from point A to point B. But this is one of the things that really interested Einstein that led to his publication of papers, was an experiment called the Michelson-Morley experiment that happened in 1889, late 19th century-ish. And the Michelson-Morley experiment was an attempt to measure, it was assumed that if light moves through the ether, then that movement ought to be impacted or impeded in some way by the ether. In the same way that if you shoot a bullet out of a gun or throw a baseball, the impact of the wind, for example, could change the projection of the bullet or the baseball, right? So the idea was that if light is a particle, or by that time, if light is a wave, that its movement should be influenced by ether. They were looking for something that they called ether drag. And the big outcome of the experiment, how they measured this was by, I don't know if I had a picture, was by shooting light at different mirrors. It's complicated to explain it, but it's not so complicated to experiment. You could like replicate it in your house. But one of the findings of the experiment is that they couldn't detect any noticeable impact of the ether on the speed of light. And this is important within the history of science because what it meant was that ether played no discernible level or role of importance within scientific experiments. It couldn't be detected scientifically. And as a result, it really didn't have a place within science. But that left the question, well, what the hell is light then? And how does it move? And at what speed does it move? So Einstein begins with the assumption, maybe I can draw this part out. Let's see. Einstein begins with the assumption that light moves at a constant rate. And so we get this famous thought experiment that he does. Now, this thought experiment actually comes from a later book. If you're interested in the history of science, this is really I would agree with Bergson on this point, this is really a philosophy book more so than a science book. But Einstein summarizes his theory of relativity in a book that he calls Relativity, and he explains it non-mathematically, which is really cool. But in this book, Einstein gives a thought experiment of, in his 1905 paper, he objects to the idea that there are simultaneous events, that two things could happen at the same time. So he gives the example of a man standing on a platform as another man is moving on a train. We have a tree, that's tree A. We have another tree, should have drawn that so high, tree B. And we have a train that's moving this way. And this is point, we'll say point X. Point X is the halfway point. So we have a train that's moving, and Einstein says, imagine the train is moving so fast it's approaching the speed of light. Now, both of them then, when they reach point X, share the same frame of reference. Now Einstein says, imagine a lightning strike at point A and point B. Lightning strikes at point A and point B at the same time. Einstein says that we have to consider both of these men in two separate coordinate systems. And if you accept that the speed of light is a universal constant, that the speed of light doesn't change, the implications of this thought experiment, there's a lot of math that backs this up. Again, can't do the math part, but I can do the thought experiment part, okay? But the implication, if you assume light is moving at the same rate, and you ask the question, do both of these men, when they reach point X, or when the guy on the train reaches point X, do they see the lightning strike? Do they experience the lightning strike happen at the same time? Einstein says, no, they don't. That the person on the train will experience the lightning strike at point B before he sees the lightning strike at point A. So what changes in the experiment is not the speed of light, but what changes is time, which is really weird. And a lot of people had major problems with that. It's not that easy to accept. Okay. Oh yeah, I was going to read you from the book. That's why I brought it in the first place. So events which are simultaneous, and this is Einstein, with reference to the embankment are not simultaneous with reference to the train, and vice versa. Every reference body, every coordinate system, these two people would be in different coordinate systems, has their own particular time. Unless we are told the reference body to which the statement of time refers, there is no meaning in a statement of the time of an event. So, according to Einstein, unless you are given the coordinate system, if somebody makes a statement about time, it's meaningless. So, when they met at the Society of French Philosophy, and this is, do we have handouts of this? A few.
Yeah, I'm severely limited on print points.
No, you're good. You're good. Well, maybe we can
I
share.
requested more twice.
Does anybody? I'm going to read an extended quote. So Einstein presents his paper. You know one? Oh no. Anybody else need one?
Yeah, that also is in the PDF I sent on the group.
Okay.
If you want to-
Cool. So Einstein presents his paper. Bergson's there. They are aware of each other's existence. Einstein specifically is aware of Bergson because Bergson's the reason why he didn't get the Nobel Prize for his theory of relativity, right? So not on the best of terms, just out the gate. Bergson is encouraged to go to the meeting. He's kind of reluctant at first, but they get him there. They sit him in the same room with Einstein. Einstein gives his presentation. I'm imagining it was pretty awkward. As soon as Einstein finishes his presentation, they're like, hey, Bergson, do you have anything you want to say? So Bergson's response, and I'm not sure what page we can find this on. Oh, it's on the first page, bottom paragraph, first page. Bergson is asked to give a response to Einstein. And Bergson says, common sense believes in a single time, the same for all beings and all things. By common sense here, he means intuition. Common sense, intuition. Where does this belief come from? Each of us feels that we endure. And this duration is the very flow, continuous and undivided, of our inner life. So we all feel that we endure. And from that intuition of time, we can deduce various attributes of time. That time is extended, that we have existed in the past, that our past selves have contributed, it's a weird way of saying it, contributed some way to our who we are today. That stretch of duration is undivided. It's not broken up. It's not piecemeal. Right? We may not remember every single thing that's happened to us, but what we do accept is that we've lived for that extended period of time. That it's continuous, that it's unified in that respect, and that by extension, I can extend that to other people. That you all have experienced that time in the same way or a very, very similar way that I have. So this is Bergson's response. Einstein, and it's you can read it. It goes on for a little bit, but that's the most concise summary I think Bergson's ever given of his position. Einstein's response is pretty short. You can see it at the very end there. He gives a couple of paragraphs. turn to the very last bit of Einstein's response. So Bergson explains all this, he gives his argument for intuition, he gives his argument for the experience of duration, and everybody shares this experience. Einstein's response, by contrast, you can see is one paragraph in length, and he ends it with, thus, there is no time of the philosopher. Guess we could pack it up, right? Doesn't exist. There is no time. Now, I try to stress this a lot when I teach this, especially my students. Like, it sounds kind of like Einstein's being an asshole here. Maybe he was. It's good reason to think that he might be a little bit upset with Bergson. Another thing to remember is that he's giving this lecture in French. French is not his native language. He apologizes at the beginning. Hey, my French is not that great. Please don't judge me. But notice, and you also don't want to read, like with a text message, you don't want to read like intent or emotion into somebody's response, as much as possible. But notice the second part of that. There is no time of the philosopher. There is only a psychological time different from the time of the physicist. Now, I based most of my interpretation of Bergson's response on what that distinction that Einstein just brought up. There is a French philosopher, his name is Alexander Fredette, who says that you can read Bergson in one of two ways with respect to Einstein. One as him trying to fit his idea and understanding of time within the context of relativity, which is probably what's happening. Or two, as Bergson presenting some sort of like actual objection to relativity. Famously, the British philosopher Bertrand Russell would read Bergson as offering offering an objection to relativity. He would accuse Bergson of anti-intellectualism, and Russell single-handedly kind of made Bergson a byword for the philosophical community for about 50 years, inadvertently. You can look at the publication rate on people who write about Bergson, and after the 30s, in the English-speaking world, it just like plummets. It's recently picked up, about the past 20 years or so, but Russell went a long way. I don't know what he had against Bergson. Two didn't necessarily see eye to eye, but he went a long way to disparage the writing of Bergson. Whether or not Russell's justified, again, different topic for a different day. But I bring that up to say, to go back to the timeline that I had up earlier, most of Bergson's work on time and his ideas of time had already been established before Einstein even thought of relativity. So I think historically, the most historically accurate reading would be to read Bergson as trying to fit his ideas. And Bergson also publishes a book in 1922 following the debate called Duration and Simultaneity, trying to fit his ideas within Einsteinian relativity. But if Bergson's offering an objection, and if you read, there's Sean Power recently published an introduction to the philosophy of time and presents Bergson's offering an objection. What the objection would be is that, and this is one of the big takeaway questions that I'll leave you all with, I guess, is that there is a fundamental disconnect, separation, an incredibly large gap between time as it's described by physics and time as we all experience it. Philosophically, that's weird. Not only is it weird, it's kind of troubling, because time is one of those kind of like core beliefs that we all have. It's one of those, like, it could be considered like a properly basic belief. I don't have to convince you that you have grown old over time, or are growing older, that you have had a past. That's not something that people sit around and argue about unless you're a philosophy major. But it's not something that you really have to be convinced of. So for that to be wrong, for that to be not just wrong, but catastrophically wrong, it raises a lot of questions. But I think what Bergson's getting at, and I think what Einstein was kind of privy to, was to point out another historical note is that psychology in early 20th century France and across the globe wasn't really psychology as we think of it. In fact, in France, psychology hadn't quite split from philosophy yet. There's a famous French philosopher named Pierre Janet, who wrote in the early 20th century, and he graduated with his doctorate in philosophy, even though he's doing like experimental psychology. They overlapped a lot with each other. But both Bergson and Einstein, I think, are recognizing the fact that there is this big difference. So one of the big questions between psychological descriptions of time and physical descriptions of time. So I think one of the big questions is, why is our experience of time so different from that that's described by physics? Because in physics, we live in essentially a timeless universe. Time plays no significant role in the basic mathematical foundations of contemporary physics, the block universe. It's a timeless, tenseless universe. Well, then why do we experience it? That's a big question. Philosophically, a big question would be, well, how do we come to know time? How do we know about time? Because Bergson's argument is that we know about time through our experience. That's a powerful argument, because you all can relate to that and can confirm that. Einstein's argument is that we know about time through mathematical descriptions. That's weird. Yeah, it's weird. Not only that, but that mathematical descriptions are more correct than your basic experience. Okay, so that's the talk. I'll open it up for questions, but that's the gist of it. Yeah. Sorry for the tech issues. Questions?
I think if Einstein ever used a microwave, he might agree more with Bergson.
Yeah? Having to wait on your food
He
at night?
basically invented the microwave.
Radiation, yeah.
Wait, so does the
Like
microwave?
Einstein's discovery, which he won the Nobel Prize for, was used in the technology.
So like, but can we give you radiation poisoning?
Bergson burger.
Bergson burrito, yeah. Yes?
Yeah, so you tapped into Wittgenstein a lot, and we get this kind of sense by the end that like we're kind of dealing with two language games when it comes to physics, when it comes to time, right? We have this sort of physical understanding that Einstein gives, and sort of like a phenomenological, like grounded, like I just feel time explanation. Do you think that there is like a there should be like a big impetus to like move towards a correct version of time, or do you think that it's okay where it is currently?
Yeah. I don't know if I can really say where it is currently. It might be beyond the scope of, but so the one of the implications for this that Bachelard deals with is to emphasize the fact. I think there's kind of a couple of different ways you could take this. The way that Bachelard takes it is to go to the extreme route and say that it's relativity all the way down, so to speak, and that relativistic descriptions have implications for our psychological processes or for psychology. Didn't really touch on this, didn't really go into it, but Bachelard's kind of offering like a proto-therapy of sorts. But the reason why Bachelard would say this is important, phenomenologically speaking, is that it gets us away from like temporal determinism. Bachelard, this is one of his big critiques of people like Freud in the psychoanalytic school. So Freud, for example, would say that who you are today is largely determined by like childhood trauma that you had, and that you're going to spend your whole life trying to figure out how to deal with that trauma in one way, shape, or form. Bachelard says that one of the implications of relativity, that if we take it seriously with respect to our experience of time, is that we would no longer be temporally bound by our past. And so things like, to get more, I was going to say metaphysical, that's not the right word. So things like, or even ethically, things like forgiveness would be possible, or things like healing would be possible. So that would be one interesting implication. I don't know enough about Wittgenstein to say anything about him, but yeah, don't know if that helps. Yeah.
Well, two things. First, before Bergson, David Hume gave a phenomenological theory of duration. So.
Early modern philosophy. Yeah.
But is it possible that they're talking past each other? They actually agree more than they. I'm sorry, that Bergson and Einstein agree more than they appear to disagree. That the distinction between external and internal time that Bergson raises parallels the distinction Einstein makes between mathematical time, the time of physics, and our perception of the flow of time, this internal subjective thing. They're both equally real, but there is a difference. So it seems like that's very compatible. Is that just way off?
No, I would generally agree with that. I think there's a couple of issues here. One of which is Einstein is actually very philosophically literate. He cites Hume, for example, as a big influence on him, as well as Kant.
Did you say Hume was a big influence on Einstein?
Yeah, he mentions Hume. Yeah.
Wait, is there a class on Hume being offered?
Early modern. Is it just Hume or is it the early modern class?
It's just Hume.
Woo.
Oh, wow.
Take it.
Hume all semester.
Take it. Hume's awesome. But yeah, I think Einstein goes through. There's obviously a lot of writing that's been done on this because of how popular Einstein is. But he goes through different philosophical phases throughout his life. But I think you're right, because later on, Einstein has a conversation with the philosopher Rudolf Carnap, and he says that the phenomenological experience of time, especially the experience of the now, is something that really bothered him, and that he wasn't quite sure how to explain. And towards the end of his life, he's leaving a lot more room open for psychological explanations. But early on in his career, I think, maybe not to psychoanalyze Einstein, but I think because he's having to prove himself and establish himself, he's making these hardline distinctions and categories and separations between this is what physics does, this is what philosophy does, this is what psychology does. But I think what Bergson is pointing at is what you were saying, that there is overlap. I think that would be the more appropriate way to read Bergson, as opposed to Bergson offering an objection to relativity. Yeah.
I think also he said, not to psychoanalyze him,
Right.
it's kind of like what we were talking about before the, not class, but before the period started, where as you age, you start to look back on time more, and then it becomes more relative in that sense.
Yeah. So this is a really cool thing about relativity. This is what like Popper just absolutely loved, is that there became so much empirical validation for relativity. Not just so the earliest forms of empirical verification happen with an English scientist named Arthur Eddington, who was the first to observe the curvature of space, the curvature of light. That happens like 1919, 1819-ish. But later on, we start to do psychological experiments that actually confirmed relativity on a personal level, that people in different geographic locations experience the speed of time differently.
That's what we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
The Africa and the poly time thing.
Yeah, okay. So for example, the most obvious example would be that people that live like in the Caribbean experience the flow of time as moving much differently than people who live in like New York City. You can see like environmentally why that would be the case. But yes,
Or, I don't want to get political here, or not to bring race into it,
culturally, ethnically, yeah, for sure.
time.
Yeah. Did you have a question? Yes.
I did. Could you explain more why mathematically time is like it being more accurate mathematically is more weird than how we perceive it personally? Because
Yeah.
I don't understand how that would be more weird.
No, it's a really good question. Are you a STEM major?
I am.
Yeah. I should say it's weird to me. Weird is probably a bad use of word there. I say it's weird because if you think about, for most of like the history of thought, like what does it take, if you think of like what it takes to prove something or to demonstrate something, like if you were to ask me to prove that I have Einstein's book, I would just say here. That would convince most people. That would be sufficient enough for most people, right? And that relies on the basic assumption that your sensory data is correct, that the information that you're receiving from that is completely and utterly sufficient. The issue here is that Bergson is saying that our experience of time is fundamental. And kind of like that book, I don't have to prove that to you. But what I do have to show you is that mathematics is effective. That would be kind of Bergson's position. Mathematics is something that we have to learn. It's a language that we have to learn to speak. Mathematical descriptions are something that aren't, for a lot of us, basic. Does that make sense?
Or another example, compare the types of evidence involved in proving that Bigfoot exists.
Yeah.
And saying, oh my gosh, Bigfoot, watch out. One is more of an intellectual argument.
Right.
The other is, oh my God, there's fucking Bigfoot.
Yeah.
And it's surprising, I think,
Yes.
that time would need this sort of argument when we all experience it so intimately.
Yeah.
Or some such.
And even more so that the description of time would be so different from our experience. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, but it also makes sense why Einstein's kind of view time is kind of like doesn't matter, because it's more about perception, I guess. So like the way mathematically is can really affect you.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that would be a good reading of Einstein too. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, so Bergson says here, and I thought this quote was so interesting, that knowing what time is consists in observing a correspondence, not between one clock's reading and another clock's reading, but between the clock's reading and the moment in which we find ourselves. The event that is occurring, something that is ultimately not a reading of the clock. So you have like the phenomenological experience of time, and then you have this thing that science does where it just abstracts time and says, well, time actually exists up here outside of us.
Yeah.
But what I think Bergson is saying is that, you really don't know what time it is unless you look at a clock and compare the clock to what you are in here, like what you are experiencing.
Yeah. That's an incredibly important distinction. I'm glad you brought it up. So in Time and Free Will, Bergson makes a distinction between what he calls lived time and mathematical time. And they do overlap. He creates this distinction not to drive a wedge between physics and philosophy, but to point out that there's different ways of knowing these two different types of time. Yeah, so lived time would be that first part. I'm not sure where you quoted it from.
170.
Yeah.
you started.
Okay. Yeah. So lived time is our experience of time, is the phenomenological experience of time, versus mathematical time, which is clock time, for lack of a better word. But yeah, it's an important distinction that Bergson hangs a lot on throughout his writing.
So do you think math time can exist without the experience of lived time?
Bergson would say that ultimately, and this is like a move that's like really similar to like something like Kant does. Bergson would say like ultimately it's just lived time. And that mathematical time is just an expression of that. But ontologically, that's the real deal. Yeah, and that mathematical time is just a symbolic representation. In the same way that the word dog is a symbolic representation of my actual dog. My actual dog, my pet, is what really matters, not the word. Yeah.
I was wondering what you think of the idea of how, like, how Einstein uses this idea of what you've drawn behind you, and it kind of having this disparity with our kind of perceived idea of like what we would expect of the idea of it being explained empirically, the same way how Einstein empirically explained time, with the idea of sort of like of neurological effects accounting for that disparity, in the same way how like circadian masking is essentially like a cognitive approximation of objective reality that our brain sort of allows us to perceive it, but with a sort of like approximated value of what the actual mathematical one might be in objective reality, and how basically the idea that Bergson's sort of perception of time is more as an approximated one of the empirical one that Einstein is presenting.
I'm not sure that the term that you used in the reference. What was
Saccadic masking. It's, to my understanding, it's sort of like kind of neurological effect that basically is the reason why you can't see your eyes move in a mirror, because your occipital lobe, in processing the sort of like visual information from your retina, and basically it cuts out motion in between your eye moving, or between like disparity between your eye's motion and objective motion other than the eye, to where basically it sort of cuts out large sort of like segments of that visual information that approximates what's actually going on when you sort of visually see things.
No, they do really
Okay, so the question there being like how Einstein would respond to that or account for that?
Well, no, I guess how you think Bergson might respond to that as to his idea of being more like an approximation of reality.
Right. Yeah. So this is kind of going back to what I mentioned at the end, that I think what Bergson's harping on, and can't remember if I explained this or not. He's really making an argument for, I think, what we would call psychological time. But in a historical note here that I mentioned is that the psychology of the early 20th century is not our psychology. And what Bergson's drawing on specifically in the 19th century German psychology, there was this split between empirical psychology and rational psychology. You see this, for example, in Kant. He's the one that brings like the damning critique of rational psychology, saying that there is no such thing as rational psychology. Different story for a different day. But you have this distinction, in the empirical psychologist would study basically what we would call like physiological responses to try to figure out like what the brain was doing. And the rational psychologist would study things like ideas, emotions, stuff like that. And the idea is that there was a methodological split between the two. That you could study empirical psychology through tests and running experiments and stuff like that, but that rational psychology was more like deductive in nature. So part of Bergson's distinction, I think, is kind of a holdover from 19th century psychology, and part of what he wants to do, I think, is to say that to maintain that methodological distinction on some level. So in terms of how he would interpret that, I don't know. Psychology like explodes, especially like in the 30s and 40s in France, and it becomes more of what we think of it. today, and I don't think either Bergson or Einstein could have anticipated that. If that helps.
Yeah.
To not answer your question. Other questions?
Do you agree with Bergson? Or do you agree with Einstein?
I don't know. I
You don't know.
yeah. I mean, that's one of the big questions. I don't like the idea of a timeless universe. I haven't figured out how to reconcile that. My focus has been Bachelard, and what I love about Bachelard is how optimistic he is. So I'll say I'll agree with Bachelard, and I'll end with a quote from Bachelard, talking about merging the psychological with the physical, and Bachelard ends his work on the intuition of the instant by saying, not the exact ending, but not for once are you the sum of your past, that you can always break away. Right. So yes, question.
I like that quote a lot. It's funny. But I was saying, when we say timeless universe, do we mean that like so, like literally as in time is just simply not like a genuine factor? Because we talk about it a lot, I think, in sort of modern white paper science stuff, like David Wiltshire's like timescapes and things like that. Do you like what is the position when we say time is not?
Yeah, that's a big question. So in Newtonian physics, time and space were absolute values. So no matter where you were in the universe, time is measured and behaved in the same way, same with space. So by upending simultaneity, Einstein inadvertently, or maybe inadvertently, unraveled the Newtonian universe, its most basic fundamental building blocks. That's about as best of an explanation that I can give, because I'm not a physicist. But
Space-time is just there, and so motion's an illusion.
yeah, and there's no privileged temporal position.
Oh, here's pretty cool.
Yes, qualitatively, yes, pretty awesome. Yeah.
My question is maybe seeing if this is how like Bergson ends up like addressing the simultaneity thing. And I guess maybe kind of asking what is meant when he says that Einstein's relativity is epistemological and not scientific. And maybe is it about like that both of these, live time and math time, are both different like philosophies of what an event is. And like math time would be that like an event is like the dividing unit of what time is. And so simultaneity occurs when the same event occurs within that same time unit, which I think, I don't know if he would do this, maybe Merleau-Ponty would do this, maybe Heidegger would do this, that like you just have like a Zeno's paradox, criticism of like, well, at what point is it arbitrary you deciding like what the unit of time is?
Yeah.
Or like it's that your way of saying simultaneity is impossible is because your unit of time is arbitrary. And like a lived time understanding of an event would be kind of like a gestalt. Like it's like it's the whole of the situation. And so like when we are like living the unity of an event, like this, when you're making your coffee, you're not like dividing the event of making your coffee into like the different seconds.
Yeah.
But the simultaneity occurs in like the whole of that lived time of what that event is.
Yeah.
Is that similar to like what he ends up saying, or?
So Bergson devotes.
Sorry, I have to go.
No, you're good.
I
You're
thought it was
good.
wonderful.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Appreciate
Good
it.
to see you again.
Thank you. So Bergson actually devotes a considerable amount of time in his Time and Free Will to Zeno's paradox. There's a lot to unpack, but Bergson starts off his Time and Free Will by offering a theory of number. And he says the way that he gets around Zeno's paradox is he says that our understanding of number is predicated on an assumption of space, that we kind of implicitly associate number with space. So when I say one book, there's a spatial component to that. which is, Bergson explains why Zeno's paradox is a paradox. If you take away that assumption of space, because real time, lived time, is not based off of extended space, but extended duration, then we can account for things like motion, and we can explain why, for example, Achilles never catches up to the tortoise or whatever it was. I don't remember exactly, but he deals with it in that way.
Okay.
Yeah. I guess a few more questions. If you have them, we are over time. So.
If you have to leave, you can go, but you can also.
Yeah. If you came here, yeah, free to go. I won't judge you. No judgment. Other questions? Yeah.
So for Bergson, and I guess Einstein, each or lived time in that time, would there be like such thing as like an instant or a moment? This was like that philosophy after dark topic.
Oh, yeah, Dr. Eaton argued that like pictures were proof that
Yes.
moments exist.
Yes.
Yeah.
Like, would it be possible to, or would we just still be looking at some sort of like mechanical approximation of a moment and whatever we're describing? Because like nothing ever comes to a pause, right?
Right. Yeah. So it seems like, especially from this version of Einstein, that there's a lot of emphasis put on the moment of observation. And especially if we start considering things like quantum mechanics and the observer effect, seems like there's a lot of emphasis put on the moment. And Bachelard, the philosopher that I didn't talk about, but that I study, builds his entire philosophy of time around what he calls the instant, which is the moment of perception, moment of consciousness. But Bergson is not, that's kind of also what Bergson's talking about. Because for Bergson, there's an inherent qualitative aspect to time that just can't be captured mathematically. And he is talking about that, the lived moment. So yes, that becomes a very important part of the discussion, especially between Bachelard and Bergson, is over that instant. And there's this division in French philosophy of time specifically about whether or not we view time as a continuous unity or whether or not we view it in terms of punctuated instances, specific instances.
Have you ever seen The Good Place?
Yes.
Jeremy Bearimy.
I don't know if I know.
Now
It's been a while.
But that's how they draw their timelines.
Oh, yeah,
Like,
yeah,
it's the
yeah.
signature Jeremy.
Okay,
The
that's
afterlife
awesome.
is
Thank you for
I.
coming. No, that's an awesome show. Okay, thank you all for coming. Thanks for having me.